Britain's no longer Great Britain. And what are we going to do about it? So Great Britain was first used in 1474 in a proposal of marriage between Cecily, daughter of Edward IV of England, and James of Scotland. It was probably a flowery and rather pompous concept, a dream of what Britain might be. And that's what Great Britain's always been. But it's changed over time, it's evolved. The Elizabethan era, the Golden Age. By 1603, when Elizabeth I died, Britain certainly considered itself to be great. But it was one of the world powers. As late as 1704, France was still the preeminent power in Europe. The British aspired to being the great power, but the Battle of Blenheim, we broke France's predominance in 1704. And really at that point, Britain became the great power of Europe. Napoleon did his best to prevent that, a nation of shopkeepers. He had no intention of letting us be the great power. It's probably fair to say that during the Age of Empire, Great Britain saw its greatness through its empire, the empire the sun never sets on. Winston Churchill spent his life believing that the empire had to be maintained. He left the Tory party because he had absolutely no appetite for India leaving the empire. The colonies could not be reduced. It didn't fit his worldview. And his worldview was pinned in Great Britain. I'd argue Britain was great before it had its colonies, but it certainly became linked as a concept. And the truth is, by the time of Churchill, America was already the preeminent power, and he knew it. When he was trying to persuade the Americans to join, and Britain was standing on its own against the Germans and Nazi terror, he went across the Atlantic and met with Roosevelt, and he used his charm and guile and silver tongue to try and get America to join the war. And he didn't get that commitment. He got a commitment that America would do everything the president could, short of actually getting involved in the war. But he also got a clear line that it was time for the end of empires and the time for the end of colonies. And he accepted this as, in his worldview, a devil's pact to beat Hitler. Now, after World War II, Britain had less and less appetite to run the colonies, and the colonies had more than enough appetite to want to run themselves. And over the next couple of decades, Britain extricated itself from empire. It decolonised, and it gave independence to dozens of countries. It's often said the most commonly celebrated day in the world is actually independence from Britain. Well, I don't think many people in Britain today would want us to have colonies. I hope not. I certainly wouldn't want it. And it's an era which isn't without controversy, for sure. But Britain at this point had to choose its direction, and it probably viewed itself as the home of the Industrial Revolution, one of the great powerhouses of industry, with a legacy of centuries, with a relationship with so many countries, a power broker in Europe. And it was coming out of World War II, where Britain had stood alone against the Nazis. Now, some people would say the Russians did more than Britain did. They did, but they didn't stand against the Nazis. They were on the side of the Nazis, and in a pact, and invading other countries and carving them up between the Germans and themselves. until the Germans betrayed them and attacked them. Then they joined in that fight and were more than happy to throw millions in front of guns. Britain, like so many countries, was destroyed at the end of the war. And really it took a long time to rebuild. Churchill himself, beloved by the country, was unceremoniously thrown out at the next election because people had fought for 5 years so they'd have a better deal. They'd be looked after from the cradle to the grave. There'd be a social system. There'd be support. There'd be health care. There'd be more structured education. And in many ways, Britain has delivered this over the last 70 years. But in many ways, it's not delivered it as well as it could have. By the end of the 70s, we destroyed our aviation industry. We destroyed our car industry. We'd crippled so many industries. And Ted Heath went to the country in 74 saying, choose me or the unions. Who do you want to run the country? Well, the people didn't choose Ted Heath. And when Thatcher arrived, Britain really was in a sorry state. Rampant strikes, industry collapsing, nationalised industries being supported but being completely unprofitable, running into the ground. And she changed things, she addressed things, and love her or loathe her, and I'd suggest she wasn't entirely wrong or right, she revolutionised Britain. Many working class people were lifted up and given opportunity, and also many had the industries they'd worked in mercilessly destroyed, never to return. But we still use the term Great Britain. It's quite strange it's lasted. We're quite a shy lot. We don't really like to brag about historical achievements or such like. But the term Great Britain remained. I'd argue Britain slowly, gently slid into a slumping decline from probably the 1960s right the way through to the 2000s. When Tony Blair brought hope and change and new Labour, basically he was red Tory or blue Labour. He was not too divorced from Thatcher. I remember reading the book by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, and he argued that history had ended. Nothing was going to change. Well, it was almost compelling when you read the book, but the problem is time waits for no man, and the world's moved on, and Britain has been quite anchored in the concept of itself as being a world power, whilst slowly losing its administrative power and its legislative power to Europe, never quite having the influence in the EU, always being the odd man out. And then Cameron came along and he gave us a vote for Brexit. Now, he gave us that vote to shut up the whiners in the Tory party, and were somewhat surprised when a majority of people said they wanted to leave the EU. Now, people have different reasons that they give for why people voted to leave. And I often hear it like, oh, it's right-wing people. So 51% of the people are right-wing, are they? If you look at where voted for Brexit, I think it tells you a lot about the post-war failures of Britain. Both parties. Yeah, you're in London, everyone wants to be in Europe because it's great. They can jump on a plane and go on holiday, and all their mates are from Europe anyway, so it's wonderful. But when you go outside the M25 and you start going further north, you find a lot of people whose industries closed. Their factories were knocked down and they were replaced with shopping centres. All coal mines were knocked down and replaced with food retailers. Supermarkets are great for choice in a dozen different types of pasta, but they don't give a city a feeling of meaning and being and pride. They give them food. I wouldn't highlight a single party or a single prime minister or a single minister who made the decline, but I think there's been a failure to stem it, a failure to be open that it's been happening, and as a result we've just crawled downwards. Well, now we're outside of the EU, and we have benefits to not being in the EU, but our politicians have no imagination to actually implement them. And we certainly have disadvantages to not being in the EU, and they have nothing to counter it. We've had a lack of imagination and a mediocrity. Think back to Churchill and Thatcher and Blair. Has there been anyone of that stature in the last 2 decades? Well, Boris 40 was, but sadly, the second Churchill won't be the epitaph on his gravestone. And we had COVID. COVID was disastrous, and I think we still as a society haven't got our heads around how much that period harmed us. We went from a period of austerity where we had cut our cloth and tried to balance the books and had an attempt, it was a philosophy, on getting the country on keel again. And then we just threw it all away. We burned banknotes like there was no end. And there'll be a lot of questions about who got those banknotes. But our grandchildren will be paying for that expenditure. After 14 years of mediocrity and increasing failures, lies and disappointments, the Tory party were thrown from power. They weren't thrown from power because people wanted Labour. Keir Starmer got less proportion of votes than Jeremy Corbyn. And that isn't exactly a resounding endorsement. However, he got a lot of seats. He got a huge majority based on 30%. And in many ways that's part of the joy of our electoral system. We tend to have strong governments who can get stuff done. None of the horse trading and wishy-washy alliances between different parties that a lot of countries get. However, with this huge majority, what has he achieved? What's he even tried to achieve other than a bit of bluster? There's a lack of philosophy. I like my priests to be religious and my politicians to have a philosophy. Look back at Harold Wilson. He had a philosophy. Churchill, he had a philosophy. Thatcher did. Blair did. And sometimes they compromised those. Sometimes they cloaked them. What philosophy the politicians of the last 14 years had? I'd say my take on the political leaders we've had. David Cameron, conservative because he was rich, not really a conservative. Theresa May, she proudly says she's woke. I don't believe you could be woke and be a conservative. And my kindest interpretation would be that she was a Home Secretary who should have never gone past that. Some people would say she wasn't a good Home Secretary. Boris, well, he certainly thought he could deliver a lot, and he had a lot of nice words and poetry, but fundamentally he didn't deliver any of his promises. Liz Truss, gone before we even know. On the one hand, the only politician who's actually clearly displayed a political philosophy in the last 14 years. but we never got to know whether it worked because she went too hard too fast, scared everybody, and was gone before you know it. And then Rishi, again, like Cameron, he's conservative because he's rich. And because more than Cameron, Rishi loves money. I don't think that's controversial. He admits it in many instances. And he had a green card ready to roll. He had his mansion in California and he was going to go off. But he gave it a spin. And we paid for a lot of that spin. We paid for a marketing team to help the Chancellor become more popular and to become the next party leader. Well, it eventually worked and he led us, and he didn't really seem to have any answers or know what the questions were. It was a disappointment. Labour, Keir Starmer got elected by not telling us what he really thought because he knew that he could only lose, really. And now after the election, the Conservatives took the best part of 6 months to find a new leader, and she's an engineer. What's your plan? So we have no challenge to them, except from the Reform Party, who you can count on one hand. And yes, right now they look like they're going to win the election. I don't know whether that makes me laugh or scares me. On the one hand, you've got a party who has plenty of promises and an overarching philosophy. But on the other hand, how many candidates do they have that would know what they were doing if they did win? And would you want Nigel Farage to be Prime Minister? Maybe you would. We've had worse, for sure. 70 years of decline have undercut the great in Great Britain. And it started to get that people just don't feel like it's working. It clearly didn't work for the Conservative voters because they turned their back on the Conservatives in their droves. I can't believe that the Labour Party is working for traditional working class voters. Some of the decisions they've made cannot go down well. And look at the polls, that's what it suggests. But really what Britain needs is to either accept that it's not great anymore and try and steady the ship. No more decline, just steady as she goes. Or have a view on turning things around. Our grandchildren will be worse off than we are. Our children will be worse off than we are. And we are worse off than our parents. That is the first time in about a century that's happened. Our parents mostly were better off and had a better quality of life than their parents. Go back 200 years, most listeners, their parents would probably be in service or working in a factory with terrible working conditions. It's been an upward trajectory for society since halfway through the Industrial Revolution. Since the 2008 financial crisis, there's been no meaningful growth. People's salaries have stagnated, people's costs haven't. And yes, your salary's gone up, but nowhere near as much, and a lot of people it was through promotion. So we're left as a society with a choice. We can let things continue to decline, or we can accept we're not great anymore and try and run a steady economy that doesn't shrink. Or we can try a different approach, a different philosophy, an approach where we actually try to grow. And you might say, well, Keir Starmer's promised growth. He hasn't delivered it, has he? And he's not going to deliver it because their tax policies are ruinous. This is not a make Britain great again. I don't think Trump would suit Britain at all. We certainly wouldn't vote for him. I don't know who the leader would be. What we do need, though, is change. And not change in the background on a political podium or written on the cover of a manifesto. Because every political party that's had a manifesto and had the opportunity to action it in the last 20 years has used that manifesto as toilet paper. What's so disappointing me were the WhatsApp exchanges this week by Labour MPs. Was it shows you, not Labour MPs, MPs as a whole, it shows you how many really are in it for the gravy. They're in it for the sauce on their meal, for all the benefits for them, for the praise, for the glory. But how many are actually trying to serve their constituents? They are out there. I had to see my MP. And he was very helpful. He was very thorough. He was committed. And he chased. However, there's so little philosophy from our politicians. And you sometimes get clues that they have so little influence on what really happens. If we don't improve the lot of the common man in the next decade, we really should do the honest thing and wipe grape from the name.